Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Empire is built on a lie that is incredibly important to the survival of this political organization. The lie is that the Imperial military is one of the most technologically advanced military forces in the galaxy, and it's trained and built to the highest quality and standards. The Imperial military is definitely one of the largest militaries to have ever been built. But when it comes to quality, by design, that's always been questionable. It's important to remember that Palpatine was the elected Supreme Chancellor of the Republic before he became the Emperor. Like many other charismatic strongmen who are able to convince their constituents to give up their own voting power and rights, there's a bargain that must first be made. Power, even when it's voluntarily given up by the masses through an election, is still going to have a price tag tied to it. Whether you're an elected official or a dictator who seizes control by using the military, you're still beholden to the populace. All leaders are. In our own world, regimes like the Chinese Communist Party or the Kremlin promise to bring economic development and better quality of life to its people in exchange for their conformity and silence on political matters. There's no real oppositions in these countries like there are in a lot of Western democracies. But still, that doesn't mean that if things get too bad, the people won't just overthrow the government. It's happened many times before, and it will happen again. Now, the deal between the Galactic Empire and its citizens was, give me more power and control, and in exchange, you will have safety and security. Which was something that was definitely in short supply after the Clone Wars completely devastated the galaxy. Especially in the last year when the Outer Rim Siege was taking place and the Confederacy managed to carry out an operation against the Republic's core worlds of Coruscant and Axis. Suddenly, peace and stability was not just something that people in the Outer Rim were seeking. Even the Galactic Oasis, the tranquil bubble of commerce and culture at the center of the galaxy, Coruscant, was affected by the war. And let me tell you something, when droid fighters start doing strafing runs on your apartment building, you're going to completely change your priorities in life and how you vote. Suddenly, there's only one issue that you really care about, and that is security and preventing those droid fighters from coming back. And so when faced with the prospect of more Clone Wars, scaled death and destruction, most people were more than happy to give away their right to vote and let someone else make the tough decisions and keep the bad people away. Palpatine was amazing at extracting fear out of his constituents and then using their fear to basically drive the policies he actually wanted to carry out in the first place. The problem was when he actually took over. You see, Palpatine faced the same problem that many leaders in the Galactic Republic faced before him. It's always been easy to point fingers and critique the regimes in power, but creating a solution that actually works takes a lot more ability and skills. And unfortunately for the galaxy, Palpatine's skills were mainly focused on manipulation of public opinion and political gamesmanship. This makes him, like most populists and demagogues, very poorly suited to actually create policies that will solve the many challenges the galaxy is facing. Especially in the Outer Rim, where for thousands of years you had too small of a population to sustain a locally funded planetary defense force. And since the Republic has been without a federal military since the Rusan Reformation, there was really no one there to fill in the gaps where there were security issues. This meant that many Outer Rim worlds, despite paying taxes and following regulations, would receive no aid should they call for help. You see, the Republic, being an economic-focused political system, favored civil development over military development. The Republic's politicians and policymakers understood that military spending in the long term generally gives you worse returns on investment when compared to social programs, public infrastructure programs, and subsidy programs for private research and development. This is especially true when your galaxy has just gone through a 1,000-year period of peace. The Galactic Republic, in the years leading up to the Clone Wars, presided over one of the most peaceful times in galactic history, and its citizens, for the most part, enjoyed a great amount of political, social, and economic freedom. But the small percentage of individuals who lived in the Outer Rim, a demographic that was weak both in numbers but also in political power, still suffered, as people always do at the peripherals of civilization. The Republic's localized security solution just didn't work here, and there just wasn't enough tax revenue being generated in the area to justify any larger investment in the area. Now, Emperor Palpatine had a grand strategy to fix all of this. He wanted ultimate power, far more than the limited power he had been given as emperor in the first few years of the Empire's reign. Remember, during this period of time, you still had an Imperial Senate. You had a media that was still relatively functional. You had individual power brokers, lobbyists who had special interests they were fighting for within the government system. Palpatine's long-term goal was to get rid of these old Republic-era structures and replace it with his own people and systems. He wanted to essentially drain the swamp and then replace it with his own swamp. And at the center of that system would be the Imperial military and industrial military complex that fed into it. The idea was to scale up military production to such a massive size that Palpatine would be able to afford a massive military force that could meet the demands of the Empire's even larger territory. The result kind of shook the galactic economy. The demand for labor meant that the Empire would do whatever it took to attract laborers to work in their facilities, even if it means undercutting or just straight up buying out their competitors. Soon, the Imperial military was the local economy. It provided all the jobs, paid all of the salaries, and further expanded its influence over local industries. This is also a good security measure. It becomes harder to rebel against the Empire if your salary and healthcare benefits depend on the Empire. But here's the thing, when you put all your eggs in the same basket, and that basket happens to be military spending, you're going to have limited economic growth and development. And if you take a look at the Empire's military-industrial complex, it was basically all nationalized. You had nationalized resources, nationalized refineries, nationalized shipping companies, nationalized manufacturers, design houses. It's more like a command economy than something you would see in freer markets. Generally, military-industrial complexes have heavy amounts of government interference and cooperation. Many military-industrial companies are also state-owned, which further alleviates short-term pressure to generate profits. Now, usually a state's military-industrial complex only, makes up maybe a few percentage of the entire economy. In the Empire's case, it was the majority of the galaxy's manufacturing and industrial capabilities. This was a huge problem. And that's because when a company is not forced to compete for contracts with other competitors and is more or less owned by the military or has some large contracts that can guarantee work for the next decade or so, it naturally makes these companies more complacent. Just like athletes, you need hardship, you need new challenges, you need training to make sure you stay at peak performance. There's a reason why the United States military-industrial complex is extremely robust and advanced. And that's because most of our defense companies, while they maintain a very close relationship with the government and the military, also depend on other governments to sell their products and usually have commercial or civilian product lines that can generate additional income. Boeing, for instance, gets around 40 to 50% of its business from the US government. When it's not building Super Hornets and Globemasters, Boeing is squeezing its vendors for every penny and building questionable quality commercial airliners. Boeing has also entered into a partnership recently with Lockheed Martin, another massive defense contractor, to go to space with its United Launch Company. Lockheed Martin gets 99% of its global sales from government purchases, but only 71% of that comes from the US government. By diversifying the source of your revenue, not necessarily your product, you're able to weather some bigger storms. Now, luckily for these American companies, the United States is constantly not at war, but at conflict, or providing munitions to its many allies, trying to maintain a global order of sorts. But still, having these extra outlets for your products is definitely not a bad idea. As a matter of fact, it can make overall production of military items cheaper, and it can also cut away at your research and development costs as well. Now, I think a great way to explain this is by taking a look at how the US Navy produces ships versus how the Chinese Navy produces ships. The Chinese Navy in recent years just bypassed the US Navy in terms of the total tonnage each Navy possesses. And this is mainly driven by the Chinese government's maritime defense needs and also by China's civilian shipbuilding industry. Many of the companies that build Chinese naval ships are also producing container ships, gas tankers, ocean liners, and other large commercial vessels. This combined business means that these shipyards can plan for larger scale manufacturing. The commercial side of your business can generate a lot of surplus income that could really subsidize your more high-end development for military products. The United States, on the other hand, produces some of the most high-tech naval vessels the world's ever seen. Newport News Shipbuilding, for instance, is in charge of building the Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier. Now, one time, Newport News didn't just build aircraft carriers, they built all sorts of things, just like a lot of these Chinese companies. But due to the cost of just manufacturing anything in America, we really just don't build that many civilian ships anymore in these companies. And since 1980, Newport News has only built 8 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and 2 Ford-class aircraft carriers. Granted, even one of these supercarriers has more firepower than most air forces in the world, it's still prohibitively expensive to build so few things in a factory over such a long period of time. The United States is the only country in the world that needs a supercarrier. Well, actually, A lot of countries need them, but we're the only ones who can build them. But the problem is there's so many complex and highly specific manufacturing processes that go into building the various parts on this very advanced ship. You can think of Newport News as more like a custom auto shop that creates crazy expensive one-off supercars rather than just mass producing them. Whereas China's state-owned shipyards are building essentially economy cars for a very cheap price at a very high quantity. As a matter of fact, a big part of China's new maritime strategy is the militarization of commercial ships like cargo vessels and fishing vessels. If China ever does decide to invade Taiwan, I mean, they would need to move massive amounts of manpower and equipment, and this would actually probably require a lot of commercial vessels to achieve. Now, what's interesting about the Empire is that it kind of has both of these type of companies and projects inside of its own military-industrial complex. Take a look at the Death Star, for instance. It is, economically speaking, not all that different from a supercarrier. A supercarrier is so freaking expensive that only one country is crazy enough to build these things and operate them. And from an economic standpoint, the Death Star is not really something that the free market could just create by itself. Yes, there were kyber crystals being used by the Jedi to power lightsabers, but no one ever thought of creating a massive kyber crystal and then using that to power an even larger weapon, laser thing. There was simply no demand for it and no concurrent scientific research or technology that could have led to the private market independently developing this product. It's kind of like a tech tree in a video game. You know, some tech trees have an amazing endpoint, but the rest of that tech tree might just be different technologies that are useless by themselves, but all help you build towards that end product. A lot of people won't invest in that tech tree simply because you're not getting early returns from the first few technologies that you create. It's just basically too high risk to spend that much money for one project like a Death Star. And so when the risk is too high in the market for the creation of some kind of weapon, the political elite, the industry leaders, the military leaders all get together and they formulate a plan of their own. This is where the supercarrier comes into play. I mean, the Gerald R4 class supercarrier is truly ridiculous. It features a onboard nuclear reactor. You know how many ships actually have nuclear reactors for their main propulsion system? It's not many. You have a few aircraft carriers, also built by Newport News, a few submarines, and actually there's also a few icebreakers that use them, which makes sense. It's so that if you run out of food and you're stuck in the ice, instead of starving to death, you can just overload the reactor. It's a more humane way for the crew to end their lives. But yeah, that's about it. It's a very exclusive piece of technology that is just too prohibitively expensive for most ships. To decrease the cost of a supercarrier's reactor, you would have to find like 1,000 other ships that would use a similar reactor for it, and that's just not gonna happen. You're not gonna be able to scale that up like that. Then you have the catapult and arrested recovery system designed to launch jet fighters and safely slow them down in a very small landing area. Again, this is technology that just isn't widely used. It requires a very specific type of R&D and funding to be achieved. And so this is what the Death Star was. It was really just a one-of-a-kind project. There are very few other programs that had that much attention to detail. The rest of the Imperial Navy, however, reminds me a lot of the Chinese Navy. It's all about quantity, not quality. For the Empire, it wasn't just about scaling up manufacturing, but creating a supply chain completely vertically controlled that spanned the entire galaxy. You see, Henry Ford might have perfected the assembly line method of production in the car industry, but what China's done in the last few decades is create a supply chain or assembly line that spans their entire country. I mean, it's all connected, and it's kind of crazy when you think about it, thanks to a heavy amount of central control. So China basically just organized their entire country so that companies that are in the same industries are next to each other, and they're next to other industries that kind of support that industry. The idea is to turn the whole country into a factory. It is literally the world's factory. For instance, solar panels are built and utilized in giant farms in the west of the country. Then you have areas that focus on specific resources, like the city of Yichun, which is the lithium mining hub for China. There are also several battery factories and refineries in these areas, including many international names. China is full of cities that also specialize in more or less one thing, like Wenzhou, which is famous for making shoes, or the village of Yiwu, which is where most Christmas decorations in the world are built. And then closer to the port areas, you have megacities like Shenzhen, which can easily take a design and develop a manufacturing process for it within 24 hours. No matter what you think about China politically, this is probably one of the most impressive industrial feats ever done by any country in the world. Now, you do have this phenomenon in other countries as well, but at a smaller scale. Like in the 1940s, roughly 60% of the world's automobiles were being assembled in Michigan. Another example would be High Point, North Carolina, which to this day is widely seen as a hub for furniture production in the United States. So basically, when you organize your entire galaxy like this and create supply chains that have nodes that are entire sectors or planets, you can really scale up everything to a ridiculous size. I mean, you could have an entire system devoted to mining with another system next to it that's devoted to refining and another system next to it for production and manufacturing. It's kind of crazy. When the Empire started nationalizing entire planets of resources and took over shipyards, industrial planets, the idea was to do exactly that. And this wasn't for the Death Star program, mind you. Instead, it was really for the TIE Fighter line. Created by Senior Fleet Systems, I consider the TIE Fighter as the biggest engineering accomplishment by the Empire. This is perhaps one of the most efficient and cheaply produced starfighter in galactic history. At a third of the price of a Rebel Alliance snub fighter, the TIE Fighter, while lacking some premium components, performed decently against whatever threats the Empire went up against. No matter how good an X-Wing pilot is, usually they're not going to be able to defeat 3 TIE Fighters. The TIE Fighter's price tag was a product of not only cheap materials and labor, but an ingenious ion engine that had very few moving parts, which not only increased the reliability of the engine, but significantly simplified maintenance and repair for the system. You see, when Palpatine saw the scale of the security problem he faced, he probably freaked out a little bit. The Empire's territory was divided into sectors, a system inherited from the Republic era. There were roughly 1,000 different sectors, and in each individual sector, you could have more than 50 inhabited planets. This means billions and easily trillions of sentient beings you have to look after. Each sector was represented usually by a senator, although some really special planets and corporations had direct representation. Now, when Emperor Palpatine took over the Galactic Republic and turned it into the Empire, he made 2 really big mistakes that kind of delayed the, I guess, rollout of a new Imperial military. First, they phased out most of the personnel and equipment used by the Grand Army of the Republic. The Clone Trooper program, in their defense, was going to be difficult to scale up to size. The Clone Trooper was premium shock infantry. Your entire military does not need to be made up of just vanguard units, which are extremely expensive to train and equip. But the Empire also destroyed thousands of very useful Venator-class Star Destroyers and destroyed millions of starfighters. The Republic Navy, because of the Venator-class Star Destroyer and its hyperdrive-equipped starfighters, had the power projection capabilities of a supercarrier. With hundreds of fighters on board, many of which were equipped with hyperdrives, one Venator-class Star Destroyer could maintain control over an entire sector by sending flights out to each area. In its place, the Empire chose the rather limited and far more expensive Imperial-class Star Destroyer. It had no starfighters capable of hyperspace travel and was designed like a battleship, mainly relying on line-of-sight weapons like turbolasers. Turbolasers are not guided, and they usually have a limited range. They're a lot less useful than the missiles and torpedoes that were popularized by the Confederacy of Independent Systems, which I consider a more advanced technology. I would argue that by taking a step back from a naval doctrine standpoint, the Imperial Navy was also full of antiquated designs now. The TIE Fighter series, while an engineering marvel from a performance standpoint, was bare bones, to say the least. The second big mistake the Empire made was disbanding as many planetary defense forces and local defense forces as it could get its hands on. Sure, some of these units were folded up into the Imperial military, but oftentimes these transitions require the Empire to expend more resources by replacing existing defense organizations with their own people. Now, these planetary defense forces were probably more efficient and uniquely suited to the challenge they faced in their home systems, which was another advantage they had over the Imperial military. And because of this initial delay, the Empire could only really devote one sector fleet to each one of its 1,000 sectors. 1,000. Now, the average sector fleet had anywhere from a handful to a few dozen Star Destroyers, and they were generally responsible for, hundreds of inhabited worlds, populations that numbered in the trillions. It was just simply not enough. And so just by the nature of the job the Empire faced, it was never going to have the highest quality military the galaxy had ever seen. Instead, what it did have was a massive one. But even then, the appearance of projects like the Death Star was a very clear sign that indicated that Palpatine was giving up on the secure every sector approach and beginning to lean towards the let's scare everyone into obedience approach, which also really didn't work at all. The Imperial military is really just a paper tiger. It's a great term for this organization. It's designed to look terrifying from afar, but it fielded many antiquated and poorly designed vehicles and ships that performed quite poorly against the Star Wars equivalent of guys with homemade technicals. Ultimately, if you take a look at how many planets the Empire has beneath its control, and you look at how many assets, how many military assets this has, it's always been obvious that this was not a problem that could be solved by military means alone. You need economic, social reform, and a lot of investment from private individuals, most likely. Palpatine should have taken the massive amount of credits he wasted dismantling the Republic fleets and put that towards infrastructure projects in the Outer Rim. This would help make life easier out there, which would attract more people, which would mean more tax revenue. And more tax revenue means you could finally afford that local defense force, a local military for local needs. Well, there you have it, guys. That is my interpretation of the Empire's military. It's definitely not a high-tech military force. Even when you look at the Republic military just a decade or two earlier, it's clearly far more advanced from a doctrine standpoint, and therefore the vehicles that they're creating are also, by nature, far more advanced. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.